And welcome again to Friday Harbor Film Festival's Director Series honoring Earth Day. The Friday Harbor Film Festival Director Series presents 4 films available 24/7, which this issue is Awake, A Dream from Standing Rock, My Country No More, No Fear, No Favor, and From Seed to Seed. Happy Earth Day, everyone. And those of you viewing this presentation are invited to blog in any and all questions you may have on your screen. Tonight's screening is My Country No More, with discussion about the film with co-director Jeremiah Hammerling. Welcome, Jeremiah.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me. It's fun to be here.
Great. Where are you broadcasting from?
We're piping in from Los Angeles, California. Yep, so Southern California.
I see you've been involved with a lot of documentaries like A Fire Within, Uprooted, Aliens, Clowns, and Geeks, My Country No More, of course, Serve Like a Girl, Lessons, Virgil, and many, many others. And that you've been awarded the Big Sky Documentary Film Festival Best Feature for Country No More and Best Social Issue Film for City Rising. So would you please tell us first what My Country No More is about, and most importantly, the message you're trying to get across to participants?
Yeah, sure. So the story behind My Country No More was, it's a long one, and I'll try to give you the Cliff Note version, but it starts with, yeah. I grew up in North Dakota. I was actually born pretty close to where this film takes place. Although I grew up on the other side of the state in Fargo. But when I left for film school and went to Chicago and then later continued my professional career, I knew that I wanted to eventually go back to North Dakota to make a film. And around 2011, some close family friends who were still living there called us and told us about the oil boom. And it seemed like an interesting opportunity to go check out what was happening and see if there was a story there. So that was how it started, and that was all the way back in 2011. Little did we know that we would be filming for several years, and part of that was because we didn't exactly know how we were going to end it. We knew that they were going to, that this area had been targeted for industrial development, and that there was, kind of a battle there infighting amongst the local community members for what was the best use of that land and how to get to that point, and of what should be the ideal, landing point of progress, right? And so that was basically how we got into it, and that was basically what we wanted to explore in the film, and just sort of look at the human impact of some of these decisions. We would have never known that it would have connected to Standing Rock when we started, but that became kind of like the twist ending for us for the film.
At the beginning of the film, there are 2 quotes. One is, "To be an American is to move on as if we could outrun change." And the other one, "To attach oneself to place is to surrender it and suffer with it." Can you explain those 2 and why you chose those?
Yeah, so the author Kathleen Norris has a really wonderful book called, I think it's just called Dakota. It might be Dakota's, but Dakota, A Spiritual Geography. And it's about the author's time that she spent living in North Dakota. And I think to anybody that has ever lived in like the plains or the Great Plains, or really just wide open areas, including a lot of parts of the Southwest of America, like especially in the deserts, Arizona, has a different relationship to space than I think you do if you live in a city. And it's hard to kind of unpack exactly what that does to a person's psyche. But for instance, Jed, who's in the film, who's the rancher, when they built a new house, they built it on top of this hill, and they could see, he was like, I can see the school bus coming a half hour away. I know when to get the kids ready out the door. And there's this sense of space that becomes kind of a thing. You'll hear a lot of farmers talking about wheat fields like they're oceans. And there's kind of a weird comfort and poetry that sort of is imbued in that kind of imagery. The idea of being attached to land and to suffer with it, I think, is just kind of a general truth about love, period. Like, we go through life and we have relationships with family members, friends, products, people, things, all kinds of stuff. And really that pain and suffering and joy is all wrapped up in being tied to it. So when you love a place, even when you leave it, it's just kind of it's that idea that how much of that space is inseparable from you, and what is it about certain geographies? If is it just the fact that you live in an area and then it becomes this place that's special to you? It's so for us, I guess the idea was that we didn't have an answer. I just really liked those quotes as a way of meditating on what does it mean to be from someplace or to preserve open space, and at what cost? Because we know that everything has, any decision has an equal and opposite reaction, right? So that was kind of the idea. It meant to just be a way of framing the film. It's a great book if anybody wants to check it out, for sure.
In Trenton, where the reserve was found, was it already depleted from pumping, but since fracking came around, was it ready to go again?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not a geologist. I couldn't speak to this exact specifics of how depleted it was, but you have to remember that there's been, at least in North Dakota, 3 major oil booms that I'm aware of, I think, and there might have been a 4th, but there was one in I think the 50s. It might have been a little bit earlier. And then the 80s was the big one. That was the last really big oil boom in that region before fracking was invented. And you're correct to assume that that technology did make previously unreachable oil and gas available in that shale. And anyone who studies this stuff knows that there's different types of crude oil. There's different situations for removing it, and obviously fracking was a pivotal piece of technology in doing that. Yeah.
While we're on it, can you tell us all basically what fracking really is and what it does?
Right. So in total layman's terms, fracking is, when you think of contemporary, when you think of the classic oil derrick, and you think of drilling straight down like There Will Be Blood style until you hit something. This is just a much, much more advanced version of that uses computers, that uses special chemicals, uses pieces of sand, water, all kinds of different, often not even public information in terms of some of these ingredients, right, that are in there, but lots of weird things that essentially get pumped down, and usually at an angle to access like what can often be like a more thin or very specific layer of sediment or shale that you're trying to reach, which would be impossible to just drill down and hit. You would have to kind of do with computers. And then once you're doing that, essentially, the word fracking comes from the idea that you're fracturing the earth so in this instance, shale. So you're essentially using these chemicals and these fine pieces of rock to break the shale. And once you do that, that's when you can release what are basically these tiny pockets of oil. So you're not hitting, it's not a classic way of drilling, if you want to think about it in those terms. It's fairly high tech. Yeah.
How dangerous is it, and what is the toll on the planet Earth?
Well, depending on who you talk to, but I think most people would agree, it's fairly damaging. Yeah. The fossil fuel industry at large is a dirty industry, but fracking is certainly no exception. I mean, you have to deal with a lot of different things. So, I mean, really, the question in My Country No More, to some extent, although a lot of this is peripheral, is how should these things be regulated? It's not running front and center in the film, but it is in the sense of how do people have to deal with that, and that's where regulations come in. So how close can this be to somebody? Is that safe? Is it this? Is it that? For another film, it wasn't actually for a film, it was for CBS. I did a piece on climate youth in Texas, and we went down to El Paso and filmed with a young family that was living right next to a refinery in El Paso. And just being by that refinery, in that close proximity, it felt like you had sunscreen in your eyes. You could taste it. So you could taste the chemicals. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to know it's bad for you. I remember talking to this 14-year-old kid, and they lived there for a couple of years with his family. Literally just across the street, that's the refinery. And he told me it was sad. We were there at 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday, Thursday night, whatever it was. And he was like, I've had headaches for years, just living ever since we moved here. And he's just sick, And so I think there's this question of proximity. And I think often with people, if we don't see it or if it doesn't affect us, then it's harder to care about it. For that same piece, at the risk of taking a small, diatribe off to the side here, we did follow some climate activists. This is peripheral, but just related to more recently what I'd done, because this was last spring. We followed some climate activists in and around Texas, which is also, I forget where they are now, but top 3 producers with North Dakota and Alaska in the United States. They might be number 1, I think, still. We were going around to different oil sites, so it's not just where these things get fracked; it's also where they're stored. And often wells that are already fracked can still leak very toxic chemicals like H2S gas, and some of that you see in the film. Problem with that is that, of course, you can't see a lot of this stuff with the naked eye. Mm-hmm. So, but you can see it with special cameras, and that it's pretty disgusting when you see what's actually in there.
How did you find this particular family and location and problem?
Yeah, so I was born in the town. I was born in Williston, which is adjacent to Trenton. That's the biggest town in that area. And Williston really became kind of the epicenter of the Bakken boom for the most part, although it really takes up the whole western part of North Dakota and parts of eastern Montana. So it was family friends, basically. Callie Ryder, who's the lead basically in the film, her family was actually close family friends with ours. We never knew that we were going to do a film about them. But when we went there, it just quickly, because we filmed, actually the first time we went to North Dakota, we filmed with the local sheriff, the local fire department. We were at township meetings. We fanned out a little bit wider in the beginning and filmed with a lot of people in the town. And then it just became obvious that the best way to tell a more compelling story is to tell a simpler one and to tell it through the family. That was how we got to that point.
How did you come in contact for the interview with Ruben Valdez, which is the great grandson of Geronimo? Is that true?
As that's a good question. We took him at his word on that. We have met his sister. We've known Ruben for a long time now, since the beginning of the film. But I couldn't independently verify it. It's totally possible that he is. So we just assume that it's true at his word. But regardless, he's quite a character, as you see in the film. We met him at the Walmart parking lot, and we were filming with guys who had driven up from all parts of the country after there had been several high-profile national news campaigns, or not campaigns, but just news broadcasts about the Bakken boom and how $250,000 jobs, or it might have even been more than that, how anybody, because you have to remember this is post 2008, but pretty fresh. So I think when we first went out, it was 2010, technically December 2010. So there was still a lot of unemployment. Obviously, there's even probably more now for different reasons. But at the time, unemployment was a huge issue. A lot of people were coming to North Dakota. The one thing that people weren't telling them at the time was that there was nowhere to stay. So there was at the beginning of this boom in North Dakota, and things have calmed down quite a bit, but there's still activity. You couldn't go anywhere. It was more expensive than the Lower East Side of New York, Manhattan, or Brooklyn. It was astronomical, the cost for housing. There was no availability. So what you had were a lot, especially for a period of time. I think there was that whole winter roughly where there were hundreds of men and women that were tradesmen, tradespeople, oil workers, carpenters, whatever. They were just living in their cars. And when we met Ruben, it was actually 25 degrees below zero. And everybody was standing in the parking lot. And here's this guy, and he was very optimistic about everything. We just took a shining to him. And then we didn't know that we would film with him for such a long time. But every time we went back, we continued to connect with him. And of course, he ends up going to the church at one point where their paths cross with the Ryder's family. But he obviously represents kind of the human face of a lot of what happens in the oil industry. And he's been through a lot, but he's a really wonderful guy. And so we were blessed to cross paths with him, for sure.
Who originally owned the land? I missed that part. Who owned the land that the church sat on?
Yeah, so this was a problem, for the film in the sense that as any filmmaker often can tell you, sometimes you don't need to know all the details, but at the same time, the details are important. So the land where the church sits and everything surrounding that, the church actually belonged to Dwight, who was a farmer you briefly meet in the film, but everything surrounding it belonged to Roger, Kelly's uncle. And so one of the problems, or one of the things that a lot of farmers find themselves in the middle of, certainly in this instance, but I'm sure in many other instances that are similar across the country where oil booms are happening in rural areas, is that you have to decide, if you're a landowner, how you're going to deal with this, especially if you might not even want to make a decision, but the fact is that other people around you are, and the way that the zoning works and the way that the money works, that a piece of land that, say, gets spot zoned industrial becomes exponentially more expensive, and it changes the speculation around that land, which then brings city planning and those types of things into factor. It's further complicated, I suppose, from a film perspective, by the fact that people who are used to growing up in cities might look at a film like this and say, well, it doesn't really look like that many people are there. But it's hard to, when your every neighbor is a mile parcel away from you, but you still have, say 20 households within a 1 mile radius, or several mile radius of a refinery. It visually doesn't carry the same impact that it physically does, right? So for Roger, the story that we try to condense, however, hopefully somewhat successfully in the film, was that he, at a certain point, was convinced by a neighbor to sell the land surrounding the church with the idea that it could eventually go towards a corn-based ethanol plant. And now you see the gradations here, because it's like, would an ethanol plant be better than a diesel refinery? Maybe not. And if it were still in that same area, but from the perspective of a farmer who grows corn as a rotational crop, it made more sense, and then when that didn't happen, but the rail port ends up coming into that space, the rail port becomes, in this instance, in our story, the justification to continue the industrial development, because now all of a sudden you have rail ports that is really what you need. Because at a certain point, I'm sure it's different everywhere, but in North Dakota specifically, but really, you have just oil, you have to move it. So you have to make decisions. You're either going to pipe it, you're going to truck it, or you're going to find out whatever other, but you have to have a means to get it out of there. And so the train becomes a really powerful tool for industry to justify this development.
Why didn't the church want to move when they first proposed taking that land? Why did they fight that?
It's been a little while now, so I'm forgetting what was top of mind, but I think part of it is, initially there wasn't any development there. So, and even, to be quite fair, like, even over the course of the 5-6 years that we were filming there, it was a slow creep. So I think there was just this feeling that if they fought it, they would be able to stop it, because a lot of these people also live very close to the church. So it's, in a way, the church is just kind of a symbol, but they basically still live right there. So it's the same kind of idea. If they could have moved the church, but they still would have been dealing with the same stuff. And I think for them it was more symbolic, in the sense that, because it's not obviously, you see, it's not a huge congregation, and I'm pretty sure there were more people there that day because we were filming. Yeah, but in terms of the refinery, since you brought it up, it has not yet been built. But I did, Callie, who wanted to say hi to everybody, did text me, because I did check in with her about it, and she said right now there's still a lot of meetings to put a biodiesel refinery there. Mel Falcon, unfortunately passed away, was one of the guys in the film who was leading that initial push to kind of clear the way for that refinery, and he's the one who's in the library meeting kind of defending it. That never happened, and so I think but the zoning remains. So there are still people who essentially still want to push a biodiesel refinery through, and because it's biodiesel, I think they're getting various degrees of support. But the bittersweet sort of thing for that it hasn't happened yet, but it's a constant threat, depending on how you look at it, right?
Did you see any of those commissioners making any kind of graft corruption with the good old buddies? Were they going to get money under the table? Or are they pretty much?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, please.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that came up for sure. I don't think it ended up in the film, but Dan Kalal, who was the county commissioner at the time that we filmed with, most consistently anyway, outside of just the actual commission meetings. It was interesting filming with him because he was very pro development. He was also a farmer, also like I think a third generation North Dakotan, and had a pretty, like, I would say, pragmatic view towards it. I think in the beginning he was very pro development, and then by the end he had a lot more. Just people had kind of like had it a little bit, after about a 4 or 5 year period, because you just had so many. I mean, if you ever, these were long meetings, and they would happen every other week or every week. You'd have 4, 5, 6 hours, and people are just coming to propose different things. And at a certain point, you're just kind of playing whack-a-mole. You're like, okay, pass it or don't pass it, because there's just so many different things. But at a certain point, obviously a lot of people were coming in support. Other people were coming because they're, against this or that, because people were trying to build things and have different storage and all kinds of stuff. And obviously the tricky part is that you need a lot of this stuff in a boomtown. There's this enormous need. And then everything, when things are booming, and then when they bust, there's nothing there. So as far as we could tell, I mean, I'm sure there were kickbacks. I don't know. I mean, Dan certainly denied that. I think I'm sure that he said people had propositioned them and, try to bring brownies over and say, by the way, we've got this rail port we want to build or whatever, and like, he's like, come on, we're not country. Actually, Dan's words were, it's like, I don't know what you think we are, but we're not country bumpkins out here. And, there were a few things like that where you saw people that were coming in, certainly from out of town, who weren't local, who were trying to get projects approved. And, I can't speak to how many of them were, noble and would have been needed, and versus being like a little more shady. I mean, I think it's just, anytime there's some sort of opportunistic situation, you're going to have people that are going to try to take advantage of it. And, to be fair, I mean, I'm not on it every day, but at least when we were there filming for the bulk of the film, regulation was very lax, to be quite frank. And so you have those are become major concerns too.
So in that filming of the hearings, you must have cut out a lot then, because it sounded just like a kangaroo court, bang, bang, closed. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the actual hearings for, that we filmed and put in the film for the refinery, and there's several that are included in the film because there's different stages along the way for getting approved. So you're right. The initial zoning that cleared the area to be approved for industrial use did happen pretty quickly. But then, as you see in the film, some of the initial, because of it felt like there was a lot going on behind the scenes, and there was so much that we just couldn't necessarily include because it's so convoluted. But a lot of it has to do with money and partners and disagreements. And at a certain point, when County Commissioner Dan Kalal saw that not only was there infighting, clearly that there was also, they were asking for more acreage, and the community members that were living in the area was well established. So it felt like a big jump to say, well, we only want, I forget what the exact acreage was, but like 1 or 2 acres, and then have that expand to 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 or whatever. At a certain point, even the county commissioners were like, look, guys, come on, people do live down there, and you can't do that. So the tricky part about this whole thing, I suppose, is that I mean, this is obviously a microcosm, but I think what is tough when you see these types of boom situations going on is that a lot of people do leave, um, and then you don't have necessarily the same composition for that area, which is neither good nor bad. That happens to towns regardless. But it is a strange thing in the sense that what you're trying to preserve often displaces, the original residents and things like that. So there are all kinds of strange, not simple results from these types of really complicated industries that converge on towns that are going through rapid industrial development like this.
You got into one section where there were two people, the lead character and somebody and their grandparents who lost their homes. Did they lose them to failed farming or fracking?
So Callie's family's backstory in the film is about the farm crisis, and that was her family lost their farm in the 80s when she was a kid. Now they still live out there, but they don't own it, and her family stopped farming as a result. But her uncle Roger, who lives next door to them, her grandparents who were still alive at the time, and basically the rest of her family still farm, and they still live in a farming area. But they did lose their farm, although that was related to basically the 80s farm crisis, which the film only briefly touches on. It's a whole other issue. But Myrna, and who's the older woman who's in the film, who's also lives in close proximity to the church and is in that same community, they were in threat of being displaced. I think she has since moved out of that house and into assisted living because her and her husband were starting to get a little bit older. But she was also another person that we wanted to showcase in the film because they were very close and concerned as well. There were basically, as far as I know, the only people that were displaced out of that area, I think, chose to leave, but were fed up with what was going on. So you often have, and maybe there's a little bit of this in the film that you can see, but it's peripheral, industry presence on your land, on rural land. If you don't own the mineral rights, they can just come in and you really can't say much. They can put stuff on your land. So that's another thing that people are constantly dealing with, is just, you're like, okay, well, I guess people are drilling on my land now, or I guess there's a storage tank on my land now. Unless you own those rights, it's often kind of a difficult thing.
When you got inside of the oil company and started doing the filming, did they give you any push?
So as you see in the film, our main access to the oil industry is through Ruben and through the company that, largely, at least in the film, where at the time he's working with the oil reclamation company that basically reclaims oil out of frack water. So the water that I was describing earlier that has chemicals and sand and all this other stuff. There's other companies that will remove that from the fracked wells, because often this is left in after the oil is taken, and there's residue in there. So that he worked for a company that basically pulled that, removed that oil, and then resold it or processed it. But undoubtedly, I mean, we tried to film with so many people. Specifically, we were interested in the refinery, and there were a lot of people that, including Mel, they didn't really want to talk to us, and I understand why. They probably didn't, think it was going to be a fun time. We didn't grill them or anything, but we just wanted to hear. I mean, the point that we were trying to make with the film was not really to try to villainize anybody. I mean, I think people have to make up their own conclusions, but the reality is it's complicated, and I think that Dwight says it best in the film, and where he says he's like, look, I've got. He was also the one that had the land ultimately that he had to sell for the church. He was like, look, I've got kids. It's like, if I keep this land as farmland, it's worth nothing, and I'm struggling to get by. But if I sell this for the industry, suddenly now this is worth a couple $1 million, and they're not very well off. He wasn't incredibly well off. He's just a middle class dude. With a bunch of, normal big family. And so, these are complicated issues. It's like, it's not simple. And I think that was that was a key thing for us. But certainly it was hard to get people within the industry to talk to us, and that's why it was sort of important that we went to like the Million Barrels party, just to kind of get a sense for how big the boom was getting, and you have a presence of some of the industry people there. But then ultimately, the meetings might not always be the most exciting thing in the world, except when people are yelling at each other. Hopefully it perks your ears up. But that became a place where we were able to film everybody in one space, because it's a public setting, and you have to be there if you want to speak up. And so we were obviously able to film.
It's really unique that during that address and party of 1 million barrels of oil produced, the other end of that party is the amount of global warming produced by the burning of that 1 million barrels of oil. And those that come after us will look at the flooding and destruction of our atmosphere while they're partying in North Dakota going, oh boy, 1 million barrels, whoopee. That's just my, input.
Yeah, no. I mean,
I saw Ruben playing cards. In front of him was a Busch beer. Next scene, he speaks of candy bars and a graduation pin from an alcoholic reform program. What's up with that? Was he clean in the plate?
Well, yeah. So, it's actually funny you bring it up, because we had some conversations about this. If you go back, I'm pretty sure we didn't do anything to it. It should say NA, NA on the beer. So he was drinking.
Oh, Busch NA. Okay.
Yeah, we met him for that day. We met him like over lunch, and then he was like, "Let's go." He was gonna. I guess he would go down to the Legion and play some hands when he wasn't working or on a lunch break. So we joined him, but he was drinking non-alcoholic beer. But yeah, I mean, I think Ruben is. For anybody interested, he's doing okay, but he's definitely had substance abuse issues his whole life, and so it's kind of on and off. But yeah, he was in recovery on and off throughout the process of us filming, and it was a strange thing for us to try to figure out what to include and what not to. We ended up really liking that scene with him and at the man camp on the oil, basically just with all the guys during Christmas, where he's cooking for everybody, just because it sort of shows you who he is. And like I said, he's been through a lot. You hear a little bit about his uranium poisoning and some of his other health issues he hints at in the film. And I think for us, it was just important to show, just show it what it was. I mean, in some ways, he's
absolutely,
he's been beat up by the industry, but still continues to defend it. And I had just given him employment, and it got him out of being homeless. And again, it's complicated, right? But he's actually in Texas right now. He was there last year. We were driving through, and we did see him. And he's since migrated south and is still trying to keep things going. So yeah, but he's doing okay.
Well, he definitely should get some kind of a lead role in some play or some. I mean, he's got such a face and character. So
yeah,
he gets something out of that.
Life.
They're great weather shots of clouds and storms coming in, some of the best I've seen. And what cameras did you use to grab that across the skyline like that?
Yeah, so the interesting thing, because this film spans roughly 2011 to 2008, 17, something like that. I think about right there. When was Standing Rock? Was that 2018? Anyway, around that 6-year period. What we had access to as filmmakers changed. So I don't think we even owned a camera in the beginning. I mean, maybe we had 5D, and then we were buying 7Ds and things like that from Best Buy and returning them. At a certain point, we got a C300, and then I think by the end we had a C300 Mark II. So we had kind of graduated from a Canon DSLR to a Canon documentary camera to another better version of that same camera. But as a consequence of that, we started with DSLRs. So it's problematic for sound, but it's great for a lot of other things. And one of those is time lapses. It was just, you have essentially a photo camera. You have an SLR, digital SLR, when you're shooting that way. So we found that we would be filming with people, or we'd go do an interview, or we'd film with somebody, and you always had all this time to drive from one place to the other. And that's one of the things that was a real joy about just spending time out in Western North Dakota. For me anyway, it was just really pretty and open space, just very peaceful. And so it created a lot of time for us to sort of be just outside and in the natural environment and going from place to place. But nothing ever felt too rushed in that regard. I mean, certainly things were frantic and cold and tough in different ways, but there was just a natural inclination to film the environment in that way. And so I think one thing for us was like capturing space was a big concern. I mean, it was like, how do you show something encroaching when there's so much open space? You know, you don't really, you don't see it in the same way that you would if you almost get hit by a bus in New York. You know, that's so much more palpable, but it doesn't make it, you know, there's still these, it's obviously different. So it's maybe not an apt metaphor than say, you know, dying slowly from being poisoned in the air. But in terms of actually just shooting time lapses, we found it was just like a really fun way to try to capture the spirit of the film and to sort of pay attention to the landscape and to lean into some of the poetic sensibilities a little bit, to try to let it be as pretty as it could, because that's what these people love and are trying so hard to defend. So from a technical standpoint, I think it was just a lot of wide angle, you know, bracketed time lapse shots that you're essentially just taking still images and then compositing later. And at that time, we did quite a lot of them. Haven't done so many since, but they are fun. I mean, the reality is that you need the time, because you either have to set it up and forget it, or you have to be there with it, and that's obviously time you could be used doing other things. So we found that we would do a lot of night stuff, or we would do day to night, or you'd get up early and you'd do a morning one or a sunset one. So you'd film other stuff and then you do time lapses. And for us, it was just like, this is a way to both showcase the beauty, but also show time passing and things like that. So
tell us about the land grab tactics that you revealed in each segment of the film and how the oil companies use them. It kind of reminds me of how Israel keeps taking land from the Palestinians. Spot zoning industrial versus sprawling industrial.
Yeah. I mean, so my experience with it is limited to the films and TV pieces and docs I've worked on, either for, in this case, our own, or for other people, or for other news outlets. But from my experience, and certainly in this film, it's hard for me to know, because I can't speak. I'm not an industry insider. I don't know what goes on behind closed doors and what those like larger conversations look like. And I'm sure there are larger conversations that happen around, you know, hot zones, especially when there's money to be made. What we saw, at least while we were there, and I can't speak to what was happening when we weren't, or, you know, around when, you know, outside of our ability to see, was that it really was, I think, a lack of planning that allows for something that is sold as a good idea to spiral into something else. And it's one of the things that Callie laments, I think, probably the most potently in the film, is that if we don't think about what the implications are, then we're going to deal with implications that we might not like. And that is of no fault other than not thinking deeply, you know, or not caring. Certainly, I think when you hit certain, so it sort of depends on what stage, right? So if something gets spot zoned, now that becomes a really interesting thing, because then you have to look, okay, at that initial decision, who was it? What was so convincing about this idea that, okay, well, we're going to do it here. Is there anything else industrial in that area? No. Okay, well, is this going to be a problem? And then you have to try to figure that out, whether you run an environmental impact report or whatever the specific needs are for that area. It seems like a big deal to make that initial decision. Then once that decision is made, everybody's going to point to that. So it doesn't, you know, it gets complicated. I'm sure there are instances where people do it for much more nefarious means, to try to do something with the guise of actually, you know, saying they're going to do this, but then end up, you know, switching it to try to do something else. I mean, the reality is that what we saw in the early stages of the oil boom out in North Dakota was that it was pretty chaotic. I mean, it was just like, you just had people trying to keep their head above water, and a lot of people who were maybe desperate and were coming to try to find this last little bit of opportunity. But, you know, again, when you pair that with low regulation, you've got lots of trucks on the road. You've got people that are driving these trucks in icy conditions who are coming in from Texas who've never driven, in these conditions before. You've got, you have people that are backed up from being able to dump toxic chemicals at specific dump sites, so they're dumping illegally. You've got people that are just getting drunk in the middle of the day because they finished a night shift and they got money to spend and there's nowhere to go other than the bar. So they're having, fights on the side of the road. And it's in some senses, there is a classic boomtown element, which is a cliche, which is just that kind of chaos can ensue. And I don't want to say it was all chaos, because I think that there was such a heavy amount of industry that the fact that it continues and people are alive, speaks something to whatever you want, whatever side of the argument you fall on. I mean, it's just no simple way to explain it other than to go experience it when things are actually that busy, and you start to see it in a different light. Because I think it's much easier to just say these are the bad guys, and often maybe that is true sometimes, that the real forces that are pushing something into a bad direction, or in a direction that's really affecting a lot of people negatively, it's often just negligence. It's people just not paying attention to the repercussions, and then that situation then gets worse. So I think that's the message of the film. Not that there's a conspiracy, not that there's bad guys, but that if we would benefit from thinking a little bit more deeply about what the things are that we're trying to engage, and to listen to each other a little bit better, and find ways to communicate more effectively. Maybe it's not probably an incredibly sexy message, but I do think there's a lot to be learned from listening to people that you don't agree with, and really listening to them, not just like waiting for your turn to talk. Which is, to be quite frank, it's a really tough thing to say. It's easy to say that. It's a really hard thing to do, especially when we're talking about like environmentalism. Callie always said, where she grew up in North Dakota, environmentalism was a dirty word, and so it's like, these things they have stigmas on either side, right? Not that and we often think that we take sides, and because we do. And I think we're just trying to, sorry, I'm rambling now, but I'm basically just saying we weren't trying to make hard and fast decisions to just say oil is bad. I think the film takes a stance about, how we feel, but certainly how the characters feel. And I think we were just more interested in kind of a meditation on it that raises more questions, basically.
That's great. Yes. Towards the end there, we had the scene. I guess her name was Sally. The end of the scene, she was on the river there, and she was saying that she loved it there and couldn't let it go as much as she wanted to. And then her expression went to some huge question mark. Then you zoomed in, showed her as a child many years before with that exact same expression. Did you do that on purpose? Did you see that? I mean, it was the exact same expression.
Yeah, Rita, the co-director, co-shooter, and co-producer, my wife, we did it all together. And then my brother helped as well. But we had a lot of other editors and great people that helped us make the film. But often these shoots were just the three of us, or my brother, and then my dad also was there with us a couple times, which was great fun. He was able to join. But that was Rita's idea. We had some family footage of the riders, and she was like, oh my God, we shot this scene, which we kind of had a feeling was going to be the last scene with Callie, because we went down to the pipeline. You sort of see where it's all coming across the river. There's all this, hubbub about pipelines, and they're rightfully so. But then it's just like, you go to the source of it, and it's just like crossing a river, and it crosses so many times. And it's just like one of those things where you're still kind of in a quiet space. And the juxtaposition of seeing that from Standing Rock was strange, because you think about what a pipeline really is, and it's going to span, thousands and thousands of miles, and you have all these points where it crosses water, or it does this, or it does that. And, it just happened to be this place where she grew up. So we figured we'd go down there. Yeah. When she did that it just felt right. I don't know. It felt like you know, this somehow this look, this is her, this is this part of her that hasn't changed, but this is the part of her that you know, hasn't changed much in a place that has changed quite a lot. And this kind of open preponderance on what does it mean to fall in love with broken places. And you know, I think to me that's basically bookends the film. I mean, you asked about the quote from Kathleen Norris, to be tied to the land is to suffer with it. It's the same thing. It's anything you love, you're going to fight for, and it's going to hurt you. So that's just it.
Sorry for that. We're kind of in a dog zoo here. Well, thank you, Jeremiah. So where do you go from here? What's next?
Yeah. So Rita and I are both working on several films. She is working on a doc. She's actually leaving for London for a doc about a horse jumper named Nick Skelton, and then she's also working on another film about the first all-female metal band out of Lebanon called Slave to Sirens, and it's a coming-of-age story about these young Lebanese women trying to make it in the music industry and survive modern-day Lebanon, which is a wonderful, beautiful, crazy place. Also a very complicated story, but with a very personal connection. So she's off working on that. She says hello. She wishes she could be here. But those are two films that she's actually working on a lot more. I'm working on one, right, and then we're also working on another one that we're in post on called Eternal Life Fan Club, which is sort of a doc drama comedy about these young men who are trying to live forever. And that's hopefully will be finished by the end of the year, but we'll see. Docs, as we've all learned, and many of you know, take time to make. So we've been working on that for a few years. But yeah, we managed to keep our hands in a lot of different honeypots. So we're trying to, we're always working on stuff. I have another film about a Chicago artist, Sergio Mayora, who's a Mexican-American folk artist, basically, who's kind of advanced in age and is kind of a sort of trickster, kind of a goofy guy who's Chicago legend, sort of. So I've got that in my back pocket that I've been also kind of doing as a passion project. But yeah, we're always working on stuff. If people want to get a hold of us, they can either go to Rita's page, Rita Baghdadi, BAGHDADI.com, or endlesseye.com. We're bad about updating it often, but we need to do that. And or they can just try to contact us directly. But yeah, we would be happy to do this again. And obviously, thanks for having us. And I'm sorry I was the only one that was able to make it, but everyone else sends their hellos and thanks for taking time to host it and to watch the film. I really appreciate it.
Well, please keep us posted, and thanks to our man behind the curtain who makes all these ones and zeros move like magic. His name is Mark Kyle. Good night to all, and we'll see you for the next magic show.